Fuel prices surging, shipping lanes in chaos, a war breaking out 12,000 kilometers away, and your grocery bill is about to feel it. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched what's now being called Operation Epic Fury, a massive coordinated military strike on Iran. This is not just a Middle East story. This is your story, because what happens in the Strait of Hormuz doesn't stay in the Strait of Hormuz. Today, we're breaking down exactly how this war will hit the Australian and New Zealand economies, and what it means for your mortgage, your fuel tank, and your job. Stay with me, because the numbers here are wild. Let's set the scene fast. This conflict didn't come out of nowhere. It's the culmination of years of escalating tension. The October 7th, 2023 Hamas attacks on Israel, the June 2025 12-day war between Israel and Iran, U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, and then Iran's own internal collapse. Massive protests across all 31 provinces, triggered by economic crisis and government repression, with some estimates putting the death toll from the crackdown at over 7,000 people. By late 2025, Iran's economy was already imploding. One of its largest banks, Ayande Bank, collapsed in October. The Iranian rial had hit over 1 million to the US dollar on street markets. Annual inflation was tracking towards 60%, according to the World Bank. The regime was financially crumbling from within. Then on February 28, 2026, the US and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a campaign aimed at toppling the Islamic Republic entirely. President Trump stated the goals clearly: destroy Iran's nuclear and missile programs, eliminate its naval capacity, and change its leadership. Iran fired back. Missiles struck Israel. Drones targeted Gulf states hosting U.S. bases, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Dubai's airport was hit. At least 3 oil tankers were damaged. And most critically for the rest of the world, Iran practically closed the Strait of Hormuz, according to Iranian state media. That 33-kilometer-wide waterway, it's the jugular vein of the global energy market, and right now it's bleeding. Here's why this waterway is so critical, and why Australians and New Zealanders need to care. Approximately 20 to 25% of all seaborne oil and liquefied natural gas in the world passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That's roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil daily. Iran holds about 9% of the world's proven oil reserves, and it's the 4th largest producer within OPEC, pumping just over 3 million barrels per day. The biggest customers for Gulf oil? China, India, Japan, and South Korea, the engines of Asia-Pacific trade. China alone gets half of its crude imports through the strait, and what hurts China's economy hurts Australia's exports. We'll come back to that. Energy consulting firm Kepler estimates more than 14 million barrels per day were flowing through the strait in 2025. Robert McNally, a respected energy economist, put it bluntly: a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz is a guaranteed global recession. Markets have already reacted. Since the conflict began on February 28th, global oil prices jumped more than 8%. Brent crude surged over 6%, and West Texas Intermediate rose more than 5% almost immediately after the first strikes. Danish shipping giant Maersk has already halted transport through both the Strait and the Suez Canal. Several other shipping groups have followed. All right, let's talk Australia specifically. Australia's Social Services Minister Tanya Plibersek has already confirmed what many feared: there will be domestic economic fallout. She pointed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine as the precedent, a conflict thousands of kilometers away that still hammered Australian households. Petrol prices. The most immediate hit is at the bowser. NRMA spokesperson Peter Curry told reporters on Monday that Australians should expect fuel prices to rise around 10%. He said, quote, "Whatever happens overseas takes about 7 to 10 days to flow on here at home." Economist Saul Eslake warned that if the conflict escalates further, or if Iran succeeds in damaging oil production in Gulf Arab states, fuel prices could climb to $2.20 a liter or higher. Let's put that in context. Australian households already spend a significant chunk of their budget on transport. A sustained 10 to 15% increase in fuel costs flows through into everything: groceries, freight, construction materials, airfares, inflation, and interest rates. Oxford Economics modeled this out. In their most adverse scenario, a full Strait of Hormuz closure, Brent crude could hit $130 per barrel. Global GDP would fall 0.3% below baseline. U.S. inflation could spike to 4.5%, delaying Federal Reserve rate cuts. Australian inflation would follow a similar trajectory. And here's the double punch for Australians. If inflation rises, the Reserve Bank of Australia may be forced to delay or reverse planned interest rate cuts. For the millions of Australian homeowners with variable mortgages, that is not good news. Higher rates mean higher repayments, more financial stress at kitchen tables across the country. Trade in China. Australia's biggest trading relationship is with China. In 2024, China accounted for roughly 32% of Australia's total exports, dominated by iron ore, coal, and LNG. If China's economy slows because it's paying more for energy and facing supply disruptions, demand for Australian commodities drops. That hits the federal budget, the Australian dollar, and ultimately, jobs in mining communities from Western Australia to Queensland. Here's an irony, though. Australia is a net energy exporter. Higher global oil prices can actually boost revenue for Australian LNG and coal exporters in the short term, but the inflationary downstream effects still bite. Aviation and tourism air travel across the region has been massively disrupted. Airspace above Iran, Iraq, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE is currently closed. Airlines are rerouting flights around the Middle East, increasing fuel burn and costs. For Australian airlines and travelers with Middle East connections, particularly through Dubai, this means delays, cancellations, and higher fares. New Zealand's exposure is in some ways even more acute because it's a smaller economy with fewer buffers. New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade released a detailed analysis in July 2025 following the first Iran-Israel war. Here's what they found, and it's even more relevant now. Energy prices. While New Zealand no longer directly imports crude oil from the Middle East, a surge in global oil prices still hits hard. The ministry's report confirmed that in June 2025 alone, Dubai crude spiked nearly 17.5% in just weeks, from around $64 a barrel to nearly $75, before retreating after a ceasefire. Now there's no ceasefire on the horizon. Rising energy costs don't just show up at the petrol pump. They flow through every layer of the economy: farming, logistics, aviation, construction. In a country as geographically spread out as New Zealand, where regional communities are heavily dependent on vehicles, fuel costs hit hardest at the lowest income levels. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand. If inflation rises due to oil prices, the RBNZ could be forced to hike interest rates, or at minimum, delay planned cuts. That's a serious problem in a country where household debt is high and property prices have already been under pressure. Currency and exports. When global risk aversion spikes, investors flee to safe haven assets, principally the US dollar. That puts downward pressure on the New Zealand dollar. A weaker NZD makes imported goods, fuel, electronics, manufactured inputs, more expensive. For New Zealand's agribusiness exporters like Fonterra or Zespri, a weaker Kiwi dollar is actually a short-term boost. But if global economic growth slows, export demand falls and those gains are wiped out. New Zealand is also in the process of building new trade relationships in the Middle East, including a free trade agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council and separately with the UAE. A prolonged regional war throws those negotiations and market opportunities into serious uncertainty. China exposure. Like Australia, New Zealand's fortunes are tied heavily to China. China receives half of its crude imports through the Strait of Hormuz. If China's economy takes a hit, demand for New Zealand dairy, meat, and forestry products weakens. That's a direct hit to New Zealand's GDP. So, what's the range of scenarios here? Best case, the conflict stays contained. A ceasefire is reached within Trump's stated 4-week timeframe. Oil prices stabilize. The strait stays open. Both Australia and New Zealand feel some inflation pain. Maybe 6 to 10 months of elevated fuel and freight costs, but avoid a recession. Middle scenario, conflict drags on for months. Iran uses proxies to continue disrupting Red Sea shipping. Oil prices settle around $80 to $90 a barrel. Oxford Economics estimates this would push global GDP 0.2 percentage points below baseline, with persistent inflation. Australia and New Zealand face rate cut delays, consumer confidence dips, and subdued growth through 2026. Worst case, Iran succeeds in sustained Strait of Hormuz disruption. Oil hits $130 a barrel. U.S. inflation spikes toward 4.5% or higher. Global recession looms. As McNally said, a guaranteed global recession. For small open economies like Australia and New Zealand, deeply linked to global trade, reliant on commodity exports, and facing a weakened China, that's a deeply painful scenario. The Council on Foreign Relations has warned the risk of a prolonged, costly war is high. Senator Chris Murphy told CBS, "This administration has no plan for the chaos unfolding right now in the Middle East." Here's the bottom line. The Iran-Israel-US war is not just a geopolitical crisis happening far away. It's a supply chain shock, an energy shock, and a confidence shock, all rolled into one. For Australians and New Zealanders, it means higher petrol prices within weeks, potential inflationary pressure, delayed rate cuts, and a more fragile global trade environment affecting our most important export markets. Watch the Strait of Hormuz, watch China's reaction, watch global oil prices, because those three things will tell you more about your 2026 cost of living than almost anything happening domestically.